So as part of the introduction, I'd like to do a survey. So I'm going to ask everybody to participate, like no hiding from the questions. So here's the question, and you can be in one of two camps. Camp one, I'm going to quote from one of Kevin's papers, is that, Kevin's not saying this, it's just in his paper, that manufacturing in the U.S. is in irreversible decline because of eroding competitiveness. So that's camp one. Manufacturing in the U.S. that's a view. The other view is...
I'm not saying that.
No, I said no. You didn't say that. You was just describing a view. And the other view is we're the best of the best of the best. So, okay, who's in the you got to pick one of the two. Who's in the irreversible decline category? Three. All right. The best of the best of the best? And we have some milk toast that wouldn't vote. Okay. So before I tell you how we're going to do this, I do want to recognize our host, the Chicago Fed. In this era of fake news, make it up news, make up the research, at least there's one place still in the world where you can get reliably thoughtful, thorough, and good work, and that's the Fed. So I just a round of applause for our host. Okay, so we're going to go like in a fractal way, similar, big to small. So Kevin's going to give us kind of a long-term perspective. Bill's going to look at a piece of time since the Great Recession. And then Zach's going to talk about real life today in a real company setting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin.
All right. Thanks very much, Steve. And again, thanks again to Bill and the Chicago Fed and the GIC for the invitation. So, first of all, since I am in the Fed, I have to give the disclaimer that these views are not necessarily mine or those of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or the Board of Governors.
They are yours, though. don't say they're not your views.
They are my views, yes. Not necessarily those of the, okay. All right, so this paper is based on a work that appeared in NABE's journal, Business Economics, earlier this year. My colleague Jack Tatum and I did some work on this. And, admittedly, the topic is a little far afield from what I do at the bank. My primary job at the bank is to sort of track and forecast the U.S. economy for the bank president and the research director. So I'm kind of writing on the coattails of my co-author here, but I'll take all the heat in case there's any errors. So as Steve mentioned, there is a popular view out there that manufacturing is in this secular decline. I think a lot of people probably think it's tied to China, that China is the so-called smoking gun. And people who would point to this view look at the loss of roughly 5 million manufacturing jobs since 1998, a perceived loss of international competitiveness, and certainly many people would look at large goods trade deficits and say this is clearly another sign that manufacturers in the U.S. can't compete with the rest of the world. So we hold a somewhat different view. Our view is that the U.S. manufacturing sector is globally competitive, but clearly it faces some headwinds of uncertain duration, and those are mainly macro headwinds and not necessarily those endemic to the manufacturing sector. All right, so what I'm going to do is sort of establish some key facts, look at the data, and then present kind of the empirical results from our paper, at least one of those results that I think are somewhat relevant to today's conference. All right. So again, so this chart is showing the manufacturing component of the Fed's Industrial Production Index. So what I'm doing is I'm normalizing both series IP and real GDP to be 100 in 1950. So just to get a gauge of longer run trends in both series, and you can see that over the long run, manufacturing tends to grow a little bit faster than the total economy. That was certainly the case from the period of, say, the mid-90s up to, say, roughly 2005 or so. The vertical line there is when China joined the WTO officially in 2002. That's when the implementation certainly took part on January 1, 2002. But, there was some slowdown, probably relates mainly to the recession that occurred, but industrial production continued to grow, and then sort of the key development there was in 2007, 2008, 2009, where you had a sharp drop in manufacturing production related to or stemming from the Great Recession and financial crisis. So the key point here is that manufacturing production has not recovered its peak in 2007, and in fact, the gap between the total economy as measured by real GDP and industrial production has continued to widen a little bit. You've also seen some diverging trends in employment. Also, these have been going on for a while. This chart is showing you manufacturing employment and total non-farm less manufacturing. So again, you could see that the non-manufacturing sector in terms of employment has continued to grow over time. Manufacturing employment roughly peaked in, say, the late 1970s, came down a little bit, and then you had this sharp break in, say, 1998 or so, which occurred before China joined the WTO in 2002. So current manufacturing employment, roughly 12,500,000, give or take, and again, that's roughly 5 million less than the recent peak in 1999, more or less. So again, a very sharp decline in manufacturing employment relative to the rest of the non-manufacturing sector. Now, the biggest problem in my eyes is that there's been this sharp slowing in productivity growth in the manufacturing sector, and there's a couple ways to look at that. The chart on the left just shows you real manufacturing value added per employee. So this is BEA data, GDP by industry. Unfortunately, they haven't updated it to 2012 dollars yet, so this is still in 2009 dollars, although the revisions weren't all that large to begin with, the annual revisions that came out in July. But you can see that even after China joined the WTO, you still had a very sizable increase in value added per employee, and then it peaked right around time again of the recession, the Great Recession. So now value added declined a little bit, and now it's started to come up a little bit. The chart on the right shows you the official manufacturing productivity data from the BLS. There's a much shorter time series, but you can see the bottom line is roughly from 1973 to 2007. The manufacturing sector, in terms of output per hour, the growth of output per hour, was quite a bit stronger than the non-farm business sector. And then since 2007, we've had a really sharp decline in manufacturing productivity. So the manufacturing productivity, the annual average increase of roughly 0.5% a year, is less than half of the non-farm business sector. So in my mind, that's sort of the key factor that explains, I think, some of the weakness in manufacturing. It's not the sole factor, but it's certainly one of the most important factors. Now, this may lead you to conclude that the U.S. can't compete worldwide, but that's certainly not the case. This chart is showing you manufacturing unit labor costs on a U.S. dollar basis for the U.S. compared to France, Germany, Japan, and UK. This is a chart I stole from a Goldman Sachs report, which they took from a conference board data series. Unfortunately, we don't buy that data at the St. Louis Fed, so I can't calculate that myself. But anyway, what the chart shows you, at least in terms of unit labor cost, the U.S. is still kind of the low-cost manufacturer compared to many of our competitors. As you might suspect, China is certainly missing from there. Not quite sure if the conference board has data on China, although OECD certainly has some data on China, but certainly not the kind of data that would allow me anyway to create a comparison with these other countries. Now, in terms of output shares, this is OECD data, and also data from the World Bank. So what I'm looking at here is that we're looking at the share of manufacturing output in all OECD countries. All right, so this is for Germany, France, the UK, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and the United States. And these 8 countries comprise roughly 80%, give or take, of all OECD manufacturing output. So you can see the United States is by far has the largest output share in these 8 countries, and in fact our output share has increased modestly back comparing 2016 with 1997. This data only goes back to 1997, and the latest data is 2016. So our share has actually increased modestly. South Korea's share has also increased modestly, as has Germany's, but most of the other countries have seen a decline in their output share in terms of manufacturing output in these 8 countries. So again, the United States appears to be globally dominant, at least if you exclude China. The numbers from China are, depending if you can believe them or not, probably a comparable size to the U.S. manufacturing economy. But again, it's I always take Chinese data with a grain of salt. But clearly, China is a sizable competitor for the U.S. in terms of manufacturing production. All right, so we looked at kind of the causes of slower growth in the manufacturing sector, and we looked at, tried to identify domestic factors. So I think one of the things to notice right away is from kind of one of the first charts is that there was a strong, a big decline in 2007 to 2009. So the Great Recession really had some big blowback effects on the manufacturing sector. So cyclical performance during the recession and since the recession, I think, has been key. When you have much slower growth, obviously you have slower demand for manufactured goods, and that feeds back into capital expenditures and feeds back into innovation, productivity, and so on and so forth. So that's clearly a factor. Another factor is demographics, retirement of the baby boomers, workers who probably have a lot of human capital built up and maybe being replaced by younger workers with a little bit less human capital. And then you have structural labor market effects, some of the things that David Otter's been talking about and Eric Hurst over here at the University of Chicago in terms of developments in the male labor force, and you have a large number of people who remain jobless and unskilled. So that's been an issue. And then finally, slower capital formation in terms of growth of capital. So that's also been a factor, and that also helps explain the weak productivity growth as well. And then foreign factors is the second thing we looked at. We looked at China, and just to preview our results, we found some mixed evidence for the U.S. manufacturing in terms of whether China explains the sharp decline in manufacturing employment. All right, so in terms of domestic factors, this is the employment to population ratio. This is for the total economy. This is employment and population for ages of 16 and older. I think this is one of the key economic metrics in terms of growth analysis. So if you think of a growth accounting framework where GDP growth or GDP growth per capita is a function of population growth and the employment to population ratio, and that then explains some employment growth, and then you layer on labor productivity. Those factors then add up in a numerical sense to real GDP growth. So you can see the big decline in 2008, 2009, 2010, and the EPOP ratio really dramatically cut growth in the U.S. economy. It's come back a little bit, so the growth is now positive in terms of the contribution of per capita GDP growth stemming from labor, but it's certainly not back to where it was, say, before the 1990s. The second domestic factor is slower growth of business fixed investments. So what this chart is showing you, it's showing the actual, so this is net real business fixed investment as a share of net national product. So we're taking out depreciation effects. So looking at the actual net contribution from capital. And also I've thrown in a trend there based on a filter by Jim Hamilton from the University of San Diego. And basically, again, you saw this sizable break in the trend, looks like around 2002 or so, and it's come back down. It's come down. It's come back a little bit in terms of the trend, but clearly it's not back to where it was, say, in the period from roughly the 50s through, say, the mid-90s, early 2000s. And then the foreign factors, clearly one of the things that a lot of politicians talk about is sort of this feature of our economy that the U.S. goods economy suffers from a wide trade imbalance in the goods sector. So what this chart is showing you is goods imports and goods exports. Again, I'm indexing them to 100 in 1950, and you can see that up until, say, the early 90s, imports and exports roughly grew at about the same rate. And then beginning in the mid-1990s, right around the time of the so-called, second sort of the new economy, structural increase in labor productivity that Greenspan talked about, goods imports have dramatically outpaced goods exports. And this is going to factor into kind of one of the conclusions I draw about the manufacturing sector. So we had some empirical analysis in the paper, and rather than sort of put up tables, I just thought I would give you in word terms kind of what we found. We found that domestic economic conditions are by far the most important variables that influence U.S. manufacturing output and employment. The real value of the dollar really had no influence on manufacturing production. We did find some evidence that China lowers U.S. manufacturing employment after 2002. We had some trend break tests, and that was kind of consistent with the literature, the work by David Otter and Peter Schott and some others that have found some significant effects on manufacturing employment when China joined the WTO. But we also, in our analysis, regression analysis, we found that real imports of Chinese goods were not significant in explaining the growth of manufacturing employment. We did find that non-Chinese imports did have some positive effects on manufacturing employment. So rather than put up the tables, I just thought I'd show you some scatter plots that kind of showed our findings. So what I'm doing here is I'm plotting the growth of manufacturing and production, which comes out of the industrial production report. So I'm doing it for these are year-to-year changes using annual data of manufacturing production and growth of real goods exports, and the same thing for imports. So you can see that there is a positive correlation between manufacturing production and imports, which is kind of intuitive probably. But the correlation is, and that was confirmed in our regression analysis, the correlation is much stronger for imports. So our story, and I think it's consistent with a lot of the literature, is that the development of global supply chains has become very important to the U.S. manufacturing sector. So if you look at some of the work that's been done, the foreign component of the value-added part of manufacturing has become a much larger share over the past 10 to 15 years. So you can think of examples like Boeing's Dreamliner, which, if memory serves me right, at least 40% or maybe more of the Dreamliner is actually imported goods and manufactured here in the U.S. So that's just one example. Another example is work from the BLS economists a few years back that showed that imports of intermediate materials were very significant in explaining the growth of manufacturing productivity in the 1990s and early 2000s. So again, we think imports are very significant in terms of helping the U.S. manufacturing sector become more efficient and more competitive, and that's certainly not intuitive to a lot of what many people think, and certainly not intuitive to what a lot of politicians think. So what about employment? Again, we do the same thing for manufacturing employment and exports and imports. We see a positive relationship. The R-squares are roughly the same. So again, imports and exports are positively correlated with manufacturing employment. Again, the imports story is probably not intuitive to a lot of people. So, just to conclude, I think the key insights from my presentation, I would say, clearly output growth in the manufacturing sector has not returned to pre-2007 rates. I think manufacturing, like the broader economy, has been hurt by some cyclical and structural forces. Certainly the sharp decline in labor productivity growth and sharp decline in labor input has certainly been key factors. But at the same time, the U.S. manufacturing sector is globally dominant size-wise, and it's I think remains highly competitive. And finally, I think the reliance on global supply chains for the U.S. manufacturing sector is very important. So goods imports tend to be quite beneficial to the manufacturing sector as a whole. And that's my story.
Okay, so we're jumping around with the order of presentations, so.
It's really jumping around, yeah.
All right, so you had everything was on one slide. All right, so let me try to guess. There we go. Almost there. There we go. All right. So, I absolutely agree with everything that Kevin had to offer up. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack and really focus on this slowdown that we have seen in productivity and put a lot of the weight on the Great Recession and what we have come about since then. And in part, it's going to be this dearth of capital investment that came about following the Great Recession, and optimism going forward with regard to capital spending, and thereby, hopefully, with regard to productivity growth improving as we move forward. So, when we look at the fact that GDP is actually doing much better today than it had been doing, and we're now in the 10th year of our expansion, the second longest expansion in U.S. history. This is an interesting, where this is the week of celebrating, or at least commemorating, maybe a better word, rather than celebrating, but commemorating the financial crisis that came to a head with the collapse of Lehman 10 years ago. But we have been seeing growth that has ensued over this time. Our National Activity Index suggests that the growth continues, albeit at a more moderate pace of late. So this acceleration of 4% growth in the second quarter, this is data through July, and our National Activity Index, where a reading of 0 suggests trend-like growth, is suggestive that maybe the second half, or as we start the second half of the year, growth is not as strong as what we were seeing in the second quarter. We're still far away from the point of worrying about a recession, which would be having this indicator slip below 0 and go down to a level of minus 0.7. We're looking at the leading economic indicators that continue to go higher. Again, so suggestive of growth continuing. And what is the FOMC expecting? Well, this is a little dated. It's came out in the June Summary of Economic Projections. We'll be coming out with an update on this in 2 weeks. In fact, I love the September SEP because we add an extra year. So in a couple of weeks, we'll not only update these numbers here, but we'll give you 2021. That being said, what we do have in hand here is an outlook for growth to be quite decent this year, where policymakers who participated in June, the 15 of them, suggested growth that is just below 3%. I'll share that Blue Chip, another forecasting group, just came out with their forecast update for the year and next year. That came out this past Monday, and they see a 3.1% economy for this year. So a little bit stronger, but again, statistically really not different, well above trend. For next year, they have a very similar view as the Fed does, which is that growth slows closer to trend. So basically, we've got this sugar high that has come off of the tax reform and probably some of the regulatory relaxation that this current administration has put forth. But by 2020, we're back down to trend-like performance for the U.S. economy. So a decent outlook is expected. But as indicated earlier, this has not been a really robust recovery and expansion. In fact, here I've gone ahead and indexed the 2 previous deep downturns, the mid-70s and the early 80s, to be equal to 100 at the trough quarter of GDP. And you can see for both the early 80s and the mid-70s, their performance after the trough quarter has been quite impressive. In fact, have averaged a level of 4.3% each of those over this entire period, well above what was regarded back then as the underlying trend growth for the economy of around 3%. So again, great acceleration over trend. For the current cycle that we are in, we've just averaged 2.3%, basically just slightly over trend. And in fact, if we looked at this average prior to the current administration, it was just 2.2% that it had averaged. So it's a growth rate which can be, I could describe it as a tortoise economy. It's been moderate and steady type of performance. It has not been impressive in the least bit. So why is that important to keep in mind? Well, during the financial crisis, we had a real significant shock to the labor side. We saw the fact that loss of employment during that period amounted to nearly 9 million workers. We think here at the Chicago Fed, we think the normal expectation for additional labor is something just over 1 million workers a year. So this was a huge hit to the labor force, where it took until 2014 to get back those workers. And that did not even address the fact of how many workers came in between 2007 and 2014 that were still looking for work. So this has been a very long slog to really get back to normal. So unemployment rates, of course, got up to 10%, and they have finally come down to very low levels. But the main point is that when you looked at, and I should also, just before I get into the wage side, the FOMC expects to see these labor rates remain very low for very long, well below what they regard as the kind of the natural rate, anywhere between 4.3 and 4.6%. They see that remaining about a percentage point below that. Could that be worrisome for wage inflation, leading to other inflation? We'll have to see what the 2021 outlook happens in a couple of weeks. But when we look at what is happening on the wage front, you can see that looking at the employment cost index, wages and salaries are moving higher, benefits are moving higher, but they're still on average just below 3%. And this is nominal. Knock out the 2% inflation rate we have, and you can see that these labor costs have been really low. So that's really the story I want, and this has been the case since the Great Recession. And of course, you've heard about the fact that real wages have gone nowhere for a decade plus, and probably influenced a lot of the upheaval with regard to our politics for this large group of Americans who have been feeling they've been left behind. So the story I want to tell is one of when the economy is growing at just barely over 2%, and you've got this large group of workers that are available to be employed, and they are not very expensive. How do you achieve the growth of an economy growing barely over trend? Well, you could buy some equipment, but then you have to worry about what happens if we go into a recession again? And there was maybe we're forgetting that already, which is a beautiful thing, but I'm remembering a lot of the discussion shortly after the Great Recession came to an end is, are we going to double dip? What is the next thing that's going to trip us into a recession? And there was this hesitancy to borrow, hesitancy to lend, a lot of reasons that basically suggested putting capital in place where you go into a recession and now you're making payments on stuff that is sitting idle is really not very smart. Or you can hire workers. And if you happen to go into a recession, our flexible labor markets here allow you to shed those workers and you're done with the cost. So clearly, adding workers is a much safer way of growing an economy with regard to the risk of a recession. And with the supply of workers being present, not very expensive, that is really what happened. And in fact, I could not pop back here. You can see that the growth rate on employment got over 2%. Basically, almost at that point entirely, the entire output gain was being done by just adding workers. And when you're adding workers to this kind of rate, you don't need to be making much investment. So when we looked at what was, before I get to the investment thing, what is expected to happen with wages? Well, the fact that we're down to 3.9%. In fact, we have now had 4 months this year of sub 4% unemployment rates. Going back to 1970, we've only had 8 months below 4%. Half of that is this year. The other was back in the 1999-2000 period. So what is expected? This is the blue line, well, the green line is the employment cost index that I just had up there for wages and salaries. salary. The blue line is our good friend Bill Dunkelberg's NFIB survey, where he asks each month different questions. This is the question: do you plan to raise workers' compensation? And with a 9-month lead on here, you can see it's really highly correlated, 84%. But we have a break right now where they're saying that they're going to raise workers' compensation, but they have yet to really do that to the same degree that matches what they're saying. Now, we had the same kind of situation back here in before the Great Recession, and when it corrected itself, it was because the wages actually did go up to what they were saying. And I think we're likely to see a very similar phenomena. So I do expect to see where you're constantly hearing can't find qualified workers, they're finally realizing they're going to have to pay a lot more to get those type of talented individuals. So productivity. Here is just another way of kind of looking at the shortfall in productivity. Second quarter is the last data point up there. We think productivity growth, trend productivity growth is around 1 to 1.25%. So we're finally gotten back to that bottom range. But when you keep in mind that this is a 5-year moving average, so the very fact that we had been below it for the past 3-4 years on this chart really says that we have been below that for the past 8 or 9 years, or basically the duration of this expansion. And I think one of the chief reasons for this vast slowdown in productivity growth has been the shortfall that we have seen on the investment side. Again, largely because you were substituting labor, inexpensive labor, for capital meant you didn't need to do much investment. To the point that we actually had in 2016 a point where investment went negative. So we actually had a reduction of the capital stock during an expansion. Very unusual for that to take place. But with unemployment rates getting down to 4%, and the fact that businesses are finding it increasingly difficult to find qualified workers, they're finally recognizing that we need to go ahead and make some of these investments. The fact that capital, that the capacity utilization has been moving a bit higher has been helpful as well. That being said, and then you add to that the tax stimulus, but nonetheless, this would have been a very positive effect regardless of who was going to be president, in my view, but probably a bit more positive with this administration. But again, we're looking at a really, really good turnaround in capital spending. And I think we're starting to see, at least, these are hard things to assign effects to, but at least we are beginning to see much better numbers with regard to productivity. And in fact, this is year-over-year productivity. We're back up to closer to the upper end of that 1 to 1.25%. And more importantly, on the second quarter, compared to the first quarter, productivity came in just shy of 3%. So things are strengthening to some degree with this investment, to the point that when you look at unit labor costs, because the concern is with rising wages, is this going to impact the bottom line for profits? Is it going to lead to the fact that you're going to have to raise prices for your goods? Well, again, I think productivity becomes the real key piece of this equation, because if productivity comes back with some gusto, that will really help offset a lot of the pressure that these wages, which I think are long overdue, would be having on the economy. And in fact, when you look at unit labor costs for the second quarter, because productivity was so strong in the second quarter, it actually lowered unit labor costs. In other words, it was less expensive to have a worker in the second quarter than it was in the first quarter, even with rising wages. And profits continue to do well overall. So industrial production is coming back. I mentioned about capacity utilization, moving back higher, still below the roughly 79 to 80% that we think of as full utilization. But again, as this has moved higher and higher, it would be suggestive of a need to buy more equipment, to expand not just for efficiency, but to actually produce more. And the very fact that this past year has been very much of a manufacturing capital investment-led type of economy, you can just look at what's going on in employment. Over the past year, we added about 2.3 million workers. Manufacturing represents, as a share of the U.S. workforce, less than 9% of the U.S. workforce, and yet we've added well over 10% of the gains this past year have come to manufacturing because, again, that is the sector that appears to be a little hotter. I really enjoy putting together these IHS market charts, which looks at the global view of what's going on. And, you know, we were talking just right before we came back from our lunch break, the fact that we had this synchronous growth that everybody was focused on late last year, early last year. And I remember GIC, we were over in Frankfurt, and this was part of our big discussion. You can see that top line is the globe. And November, December, January, February, all green, suggesting above trend growth for the world. And you can see how Europe over there in the middle, all very solidly green. And then we move into the spring, and all of a sudden things begin to change, where the globe is now closer to a trend-like performance, and in particular, the weakness is Europe, and a little bit in Asia as well, especially in China with the last few months. And Italy, you can see up there also turning yellow in the most recent reading. The U.S. and U.S. and Canada are the strongest right now in the world. You can see that also looking at the Purchasing Managers Index, very, very solidly positive. In fact, the best reading we have seen, you'd have to go back to the 2004, 2005 period to find readings that are equal to what we have here. So certainly the best post-financial crisis reading, again, suggestive of a good outlook for manufacturing. So what is expected? Blue chip industrial production outlook for 2018 is, as of Monday, they're saying 3.5% gain this year, well above what is regarded as the underlying trend for industrial production. Next year, similar to the U.S., they see growth moderating, but still, all in all, quite decent for industrial production. So, in sum, I think the large part of what has happened with regard to productivity has been the repercussions coming off of the Great Recession, where there was just tremendous slack in the labor markets. That's a safer choice, especially when the economy is only growing at 2%. If we came out of that recession, much like we typically come out of bad recessions with a much stronger growth, our labor markets would not have been able to deal with it for the period of time that we have seen for the past 8-9 years. It would have forced a lot more capital investment. But I think we're finally at the point of seeing that, given that labor markets are probably in the ninth inning of being tight, and you can't continue to grow at the rate we're growing, adding over 2 million workers a year, when underlying trend is to add only 1 million or so a year. So thank you very much, and let's see if I can jump ahead here so we can get Zach. There we are. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Well, good afternoon. It's a real honor for me to be here, and quite an honor to be going last and closing off your presentation. So I guess, for me, I'll let you know something. If you like what I have to say, I hope you think about it. And if you don't like what I say, I wasn't supposed to be here anyway. I'm filling in for another gentleman, but I hope you'll find my presentation intriguing nonetheless. Anyway, so good afternoon. I'm Zach Mottl, and I'm not an economist, but sometimes I find myself playing one on TV. And today I'm not even playing one on TV. I'm really representing myself as a small business owner and a manufacturer. And I'm proud to be the fourth generation of my family that owns and operates my business, Atlas Toolworks. My great-grandfather founded Atlas here in Chicago in 1918. And, the company, we've changed, we've evolved over the years. And today we're a precision component manufacturer. And our primary markets are aerospace and defense, medical, industrial equipment, and we've got a smattering of electronics, telecom, and we even even make some consumer products thrown in just for good measure. But, we're very well diversified, and it wasn't always that way. For the first 80 years of our existence, we were heavily reliant on the telecom industry, and I think my company is a proxy for what happened in the telecom industry and throughout the world. That industry served us well until about 24 years ago when China was joined the WTO and was granted the most favored nation status. We saw a mass exodus of telecom manufacturing, not only from this country, but from North America and from Europe as well. And, it took a lot of work out of my shop. They were almost 80% of our business. And we watched all of our business really decline. From 99, we had our best year ever. And by 2001, our revenues were less than half, and we were bleeding pretty badly. And we needed to find new markets. But, my company wasn't unique in that we did a lot of telecom work. That was huge for manufacturers around this country. Nearly every one of my peers lost a significant chunk of their business when telecom left. But besides my roles at my family business and the reason that I'm here today, I serve as the chairman of the Technology and Manufacturing Association Government Relations Committee. TMA, we're a regional trade association, and Bill's been out there many times before. We certainly appreciate his insights always at TMA. But we have quite a depth and breadth of services. It really surpasses most national associations. We have 800 small manufacturing business members, most of them about the size of my company, and we represent 32,000 employees in the greater Chicagoland area. So most of them are in small to mid-sized manufacturing businesses. I also serve on the board of the Coalition of Prosperous America, and some of the more unique points that I will make today come from my work with them. CPA is a group of 4.1 million members consisting of manufacturers, farmers, ranchers, and labor. It's truly an unholy alliance. When do you ever see us all together singing from the same sheet of music? But we all tend to agree that, free trade really doesn't exist. It's a unicorn. There's no such thing. And the policies that have attempted to support free trade have been not necessarily so good for the USA, particularly for producers like us. And we also believe that persistent and excessive and ever-growing trade deficits are not good for the USA. And finally, we believe that the dollar is overvalued and is harming true wealth-generating industries, those that make things, grow things, and mine things here in the USA. And so, we think some of the policies that passed, they've really favored capital, and they've put labor at a disadvantage. And so we would like to see the pendulum swing the other way. So when I talk about this stuff, for some reason people listen. I guess in this room, I'm like the only real live manufacturer, right? So sometimes when I come and I talk about this stuff, people listen. A few months back, I testified before the House Ways and Means Committee twice in favor of the tax reform that became law. And, no offense to Chairman Brady and Speaker Ryan, but I think it was my testimony that put it over the top and put it on the president's desk. But seriously, though, the data in many of my slides that I want to show you came from TMA and CPA, and it might be different than what you're used to seeing. And just saying that I'm in favor of tariffs, right? I'm standing up before you today, probably the only person in this room that's in favor of the tariffs. That certainly puts me out of sync with many economists who forecasted dire results from the tariffs. But another joke, keep in mind, there's an old saying that economists don't make forecasts because they're good at it. They make forecasts because they get paid a lot of money to do it. I make parts and pieces, and I get paid to make perfect parts and pieces every time. And I believe that tariffs are doing just the opposite of what some people have feared. They're stimulating domestic demand. So what you've got here is a slide showing the Midwest Manufacturers Outlook. This is a monthly survey taken of those TMA members. We survey 325 of the 800 members in a regular and rather scientific manner. And you can see that most members are very positive for the past year about the U.S. economy. And you can see some timing issues here. When the tariffs were announced, there was a slight dip in some of the members' optimism about the U.S. economy. But since that time, you can see it's kind of bounced back up. Of course, those of you who know Illinois, you shouldn't be surprised about the trend in the Illinois economy. Many of our members are quite concerned, and me too. We see ourselves as when they need money, they come to us to pay the taxes. So there's some concern there. But in general, members are very optimistic about the U.S. U.S. economy and quite optimistic about their own business. And, since August of 2018, our data showed that 56% of the small to mid-sized manufacturers surveyed, they anticipated growth in sales over the next 12 months. That's the blue chart, blue bar rather. 41% anticipated increased capital spending in the next year. That's the red bar, and certainly supports some of what Bill was saying. And then 59% anticipate increased employment over the same period of time. So we really have some pretty positive trends here coming together for our local manufacturers. This slide shows the local manufacturers' pain points. And I know it's kind of hard to see maybe from where you're at. There's a lot of data on there. But what I'd like to point out in particular is that the primary pain point for manufacturers remains the lack of skilled workers. That's the one on the top, the 60%. All of them, I mean, nearly all 60% are reporting a difficult time finding skilled workers. And it's held a 2-to-1 lead over all the other pain points for all of 2018. And we did see in the data a slight increase of some concern about material costs as a pain point for manufacturers. It is believed that this increase may be the result of the tariff debate. But personally, I think it will go back down as we see some of the noise in the metals market go away. We've experienced some really unusual pricing things, some prices down, some up. I think it has more to do with what people have on hand, and if they perceive they can charge more for it, maybe they do. So hopefully that noise will sort out. And but it's clear that our member businesses, they're busy, they're hiring, and they seem to feel that there's a lot of demand for their products. Now, this next slide might be unexpected, but a slight majority of our TMA members do actually favor the tariffs. Most of the TMA companies, they're like mine, we're supply chain companies, and that means we make products for other, usually larger manufacturers as part of the global supply chain. Many of us don't export directly, but the products that we sell into get exported and sold around the world. So while TMA members might be frustrated by higher steel and aluminum costs, they often see it as short-term pain in the ones that I've talked to, and I share their view, because they are looking for the larger gain of reassuring entire supply chains. And, the example of Boeing and the jet being made elsewhere, I think that's a prime example of some of the pain we've seen in the past, right? There's no reason those parts couldn't be made here and installed in the jet and sold, other than perhaps it's more cost-effective to make them in other countries for a variety of other reasons. So anyway, a lot of the optimism that I think TMA members have exhibited is really related to the improved demand picture. They're busy again, their order books are full, and profits are returning. They see tax cuts as good for their customers and good for making things in the U.S., and they see the Trump administration's moves as largely a good thing because they believe their customers will make more things here and need more of their services. Personally, myself, our order book is at its highest point in the history of the company. We were a little bit slow the first 2 quarters, but the third and fourth quarter are really phenomenal, and my concern is how we're going to get it all out the door. So we have a very good problem on our hand right now. The next slide starts to talk about global imbalances. And, why are we here having this discussion about tariffs? How did this pop up, right? For a lot of you, it sounds like this is like crazy talk. This totally this Trump came in and this tariffs, so where did this come from? Well, I believe the issue has been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. And despite the rosy picture a lot of economists have painted about the benefits of trade, I think the fact is it has not worked out for many. And, no country in the history of the world went from poor to rich without a series of tariffs. And that includes the United States, right? And so, talk to Alexander Hamilton and those folks, they had that debate way back when. There were some free traders and they were primarily farmers. But in the end, the smart traders, the strategic traders won out that debate. And that's what really launched the United States and the growth of manufacturing and the industrialization of the U.S. through the 1800s. So, conversely, countries who run persistent trade deficits, I believe, will go from rich to poor. And we've seen in recent decades here in this country, wealth has become extremely concentrated at the top. And the pain everyday people like manufacturers, farmers, and ranchers, they're feeling this pain. This is what put the Trump administration here. And it's why he's taking these actions. So simply put, the pain is because we're eating the global oversupply among industrial nations. And you can see these surplus countries here, Germany, China, Japan, Korea, they're overproducing overusing and under-consuming, and they're relying on us of becoming the consumer for last resort. And this really has a negative effect on our wages and job growth for the average American. And look at deficit countries, US, UK, Spain, Portugal, and Greece. I mean, low growth, stagnation, underutilized plants, and we just see our demand leaking overseas as these imports come in. So I believe that US trade action will and should continue until we figure out how to quit the job of being consumer of last resort. And we see some of these surplus countries consume their surpluses, and we see some of these deficit countries deal with their deficits. So the next slide shows the top 10 trade deficit countries with the United States. Clearly, China is at the top of the pile here and really driving some of the imbalances, the bilateral imbalances with the United States. And, it hasn't happened by accident, right? If you listen to Dr. Navarro, I know some of you may not be a fan of his. I am, know him personally and appreciate what he says. He gave a presentation at the Peterson Institute, and he gave us 54 plus ways from Sunday that the Chinese have captured market share. And what they're trying to do is build up their global champions. They protect them domestically. They have very high tariffs right now and very high non-tariff barriers. They subsidize their industry, and then they turn them loose on the world. I've said this to my friends at Boeing. How are you going to compete in 10 years? They're flying their first single-aisle jet right now, and price and profit doesn't matter to them. They will undercut you until you're out of business. We've seen that happen in the telecom industry. Lucent's gone, Nortel's gone, Tellab's gone, Nokia's on the ropes. We watch Huawei rise out of nothing. We watch ZTE rise. So, I really have some concerns about that. But again, in terms of manufacturing, China really is a manufacturing powerhouse. And global surplus countries are an issue, like I showed on the last slide, but China took it to a whole new level. And the issue of supply chains leaving the USA, the supply chains companies like mine sell into, when China joined the WTO, we saw on some of the other slides, we saw a sudden drop. TMA, we saw an 800 member drop in our membership. Over half of our members went out of business in a 10-year period after China joined the WTO. That was not by accident. And here you go. It's no wonder why. TMA members struggled as their customers moved work overseas. High-tech sectors like telecom, where we were the leader, they were the first to go. Pricing power and profitability was depressed among the small manufacturers and supply chain companies for 2 decades. And I'm not talking about the big global manufacturers. I'm talking about those of us who feed in the supply chain. The big global companies were happy to bring in low-price parts here, put it together, and sell it to this rich and robust marketplace and export it around the world using low-cost inputs and really inflating their margins. So, now as demand is returning here to the small manufacturers, as we saw in the first slides, there's the new pain point, the lack of skilled workers. But it's not surprising to me because during those years, who was going to train? Who was going to go into an apprenticeship? So we've got a little bit of lag here as we start to build that workforce back up, but I think we will. And I think some of the other data that was presented earlier is absolutely correct. We are still the most competitive place to make things once you equate for some of the other factors. So, economists told us not to worry while all of that was happening. Those jobs would be replaced with better jobs. We would be retrained and move up to the next rung of the ladder. But look at the data. These are not better jobs. These jobs that have been created, the food service, drinking place jobs, they're going to surpass manufacturing. And I was frustrated to see some information put out by the St. Louis Fed recently kind of championing this. And I just imagine, would you ever see the Central Bank of China or Germany championing the loss of manufacturing jobs and the rise of these low-wage service sector jobs? I mean, that was a little frustrating to me. But at any rate, you can see that these are not better jobs here. And most workers have actually taken a significant pay cut. They're working 2 jobs to get to 40 hours. They're not full-time, and they don't have the same benefits as the good jobs in manufacturing. But I think we need a better way to measure that. So my friends at CPA, we've been talking a lot about this, and we're coming up with the Job Quality Index in partnership with Cornell University. We've already patented this, and you'll probably see it in the news pretty soon. But so that's why, we've got a better way. It's called the Job Quality Index. And in a nutshell, it takes non-supervisory payroll data, and it measures how far above or below it is from the national average. There are some other factors as well as hours worked and things worked into that equation. But you can see that since the early 90s, we've not really been moving folks up the ladder, despite what we have heard. Kind of peaked here, as you can see, in 1993, and the index was at a low point in 2012. So I hope you'll watch the news and you'll see more about this. But when we overlay on this next slide the trade deficit and the job quality index, somebody almost said this slide earlier today, but this is it. So I believe that this is why the trade deficit is such a problem. It's sucking wealth out of the middle class of our country, and we see the social ills that come with it. We've got deaths of despair. We've got, opioid crisis in the rural America, where manufacturing used to be. We have people on opioids. We have farmers killing themselves because they are the most efficient farmers in the world. They can put out more grain than anybody else, but they can't make a profit. They can't make a profit, and there's something wrong with that. There's absolutely something wrong. So anyway, and deficit countries, like the US, the UK, they got Brexit and we got Donald Trump. We see relative political harmony in those surplus countries. So I think there's something to be said there about that. But a lot of folks, thank goodness, are seeing the light here. Today is a new world. They're starting to recognize that free trade, at least the kind they built their models around, which, by the way, I have access, you all know about the REMI models through CPA. We have the REMI models. I found it interesting, we did some modeling, and every time we increased GDP, the trade deficit went up. Wait a second. It's built right in the model. There's some bad assumptions built right in the model. But anyway, we'll get onto that more. So, like I said, I think free trade doesn't exist, and we need smart trade, not free trade. But even some economists are coming around too. You've got some notable folks, probably some names that you know, that have admitted they were absolutely wrong on this. So what can we do about that? I guess that's really the question, if you're following me and kind of agree with some of what I'm saying. I think it starts with currency, as I asked in some of the other discussion. While tariffs, they can stimulate domestic demand, tariffs, trade agreements, they only affect composition of trade, what we trade with who. And so the thing about the soybeans, right? If the Chinese are tariffing their soybeans, our soybeans will be bought by somebody else. We might not trade soybeans with the Chinese, but we will trade them with someone else, because we still have our soybeans. They're going to go somewhere, and there's demand in the marketplace. If the Chinese got their soy from Brazil, now the Europeans need to buy their soy from America. They used to buy from Brazil. So I really think that tariffs and trade agreements are about composition, and balance of trade is driven by currency, and it drives persistent global imbalances. So here you go. Somebody else mentioned this slide as well. The dollar's value and the current account deficit, completely linked. Look at this. And you shouldn't be surprised, but what should be surprising is, why doesn't this correct itself? It's broken. You can see, normally in the world, we would expect that the value of the dollar would start to go down and this would start to correct itself, but it's not. It's lost that linkage because we are the reserve currency of the world. We have these uncontrolled capital imbalances that come in. So some more smart short-term solutions for trade and economic growth. I think the Trump administration is really taking care of number one, eliminating trade cheating. They're kind of going after that pretty hard. And trade cheating goes on in a lot of ways. My question about the non-tariff barriers, you can argue that's cheating or not. We don't have a VAT tax. We don't have a GST tax. We're one of the few countries in the world. That's perhaps foolish. I argued that during the House Ways and Means hearing. They didn't pick that one up. But, there are a lot of ways that people cheat on trade, and the Chinese have certainly led the fight there. Another solution that I'm going to tell you about in the next slide, and I'm a big fan of this, is the market access charge. It's developed by fellow board member John Hanson at CPA. He was at the World Bank for many, many years, and this is his clever way to help slowly bring the dollar back to a trade equilibrium balancing value. Then industrial policy. I don't know why that's a four-letter word in a lot of discussions. You talk about industrial policy and people think, we're going to pick winners and losers and stuff. To me, it's about setting the table that's appealing for manufacturers and for things to be made here again. And we really haven't had an industrial policy in this country since Alexander Hamilton was around, and I think we need to get back to it, because every single one of our trading partners, the UK, Germany, the Asian countries, they all have industrial policies. And then wage convergence. I also have some friends, the head of the Teamsters Union, he's actually in the NAFTA negotiations right now. Mike Dolan serves on the CPA board with me as well, and they're pushing for this wage convergence. We've heard it in the NAFTA talks. This is what they're talking about. We'd like to see the Mexicans be able to buy some of the cars that they're making and sending over here and buy some of the food products, but when they devalued their currency so aggressively after NAFTA, it certainly didn't help them become consumers of any of the products that we're making. So we think these four things would be good short-term solutions. But let's talk about the MAC a little bit more here, the market access charge. We believe it's the Fed's missing tool. The Fed does a great job with its mandate, and it manages money supply within the country, but it does not have a way to control excessive and uncontrolled capital inflows coming from outside the country, right? So the MAC would give the Fed that tool, and it's like a peak load charge on electricity, right? When on hot days in the summer, when all the air conditioners are running, they don't shut off the power. They just charge you more for it to help mitigate demand. And so, when demand would be high, the MAC would kick in, and this is a very small percentage on dollar-denominated transactions. It's not even a penny, very small. But it would slowly help bring, and it goes up when the dollar keeps getting higher, back to a competitive and correct value. And right now, there is a bill in Congress, and it's gaining traction. It's called the Competitive Dollar for Jobs and Prosperity Act. So we're going to keep pushing for that, and maybe perhaps you'll hear more about that in the future. But we really believe it would be a smart solution, and it's neutral. It's not a political solution. It would be administered by the Fed, who does a wonderful job with monetary policy already. So why not give them one more tool to control the piece that they don't have control of? So long-term, trade surpluses deliver growth. I mean, look at this chart here. So the GDP growth that we were talking about, Bill, going into 2020, 1%, I mean, to me, compared to some of our friends on this chart, it's pretty anemic. It's pretty poor. I would love to see us up in the 3 to 4% range like most of our surplus countries. I mean, Malaysia, Taiwan, even Germany. So those of us who say that tariffs are so bad, why is it working so well for these countries? These are some of the most protectionist countries in the world, and it has helped them go from poor to rich in a very short amount of time, So anyway, like I said, not an economist, but I hope that I've given you some thought-provoking things here today. I thank you for the time and giving me the honor and the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. So we have time, and I think we can still a little bit of extra time, right? So questions? Catherine.
So a specific question that I have actually to Bill is a lot of people have talked about relaxation. Actually, Zach, you can perhaps answer. Is there a metric that we would look at to evaluate whether or not they're actually whether the regulations that have been relaxed and that's kind of very narrow. I am going to take a stab at some of the things that Zach used to say.
Do we want to answer that first point? Okay. So I would just say, I don't know of any metrics that exist outside of, most of our roundtables that we hold and our contacts in the business community. There has definitely been a sea change in terms of their view about, the competitiveness of doing business, that view, and there is definitely a sense that regulations are not going to continue to get more stringent, and if anything, they're moving in the opposite direction, and they have taken that as a positive, and I think that's when you look at the business confidence surveys.
Is it sentiment, or is it actually the number of pages of regulation? For example, for a lot of trade regulation, we've done
Right.
look at the number of pages.
I'm just going with the sentiment.
No, the sentiment is different
Right.
from reality, and
Possibly.
very important.
Possibly, yeah.
And I'm trying to get at whether it's sentiment, of which there are many reasons why people feel better or worse.
So do you know of anything on the regulation side?
So I would...
other than coal and,
I would echo that about perception and reality, right? And sometimes perception does drive reality, and I think it is more sentiment leading this. In fact, we've seen an increase in regulation with cybersecurity, but that's just related to our industry. So I think it's a very positive perception. We will see if reality follows. How to measure it, I don't know.
All right, now go for your...
there's a whole range of things, and I'm not going to disagree with a lot, actually. So a couple of things. Starting with the last chart, I think it is valuable to make a distinction between trade surpluses delivering growth. Trade surplus delivers growth as measured by GDP. Domestic people do not eat. Investment. When you're running a trade surplus, you are actually doing harm to yourself. Because you're taking away a chunk of your production and giving it to somebody else.
So I would agree with that, because those countries are not consuming their surpluses, right?
And that's not good for those countries' citizens.
It's not good, but I think the point is that it's so far out of balance. I'm not necessarily arguing that we go so far the other way, but that we get a little more balance and we find ways for those countries to take more of their surpluses and consume them.
It's something that we actually argue a lot for those countries.
And we don't have a lot of control over other countries, right? We can only control ourselves oftentimes, so, which is where I get to with the dollar.
Yeah, well, so, yeah, the dollar, I did write a book.
I didn't.
On this topic, and work on this topic. So, but going backwards on industrial policy, if you look at the last, a lot of work that's been done now, as I left the OECD and moved on to my new job, we focused a lot on policies of focusing on regions. Because the major loss in terms of employment and productivity, and some of the issues that you speak to directly, but this is true more broadly, is that regions that have concentrated manufacturing tend to do extremely well when the core does well, and falls further when the core is stripped out. Think of it as Michael Porter's clusters, which everybody thinks is a great idea. If you have manufacturing, you've got a cluster, it does extremely well, and it does so well that all the services in the regions are priced out of business. Then, when the core gets lost, the entire thing crumbles, and there's nothing left because there are no services there. Pick up So there's really an essential issue about clusters and regions that create an opportunity to think about place-based policies that are different from national policies. And so it's in essence saying we can even find early warning indicators for which regions of a country are more likely to be exposed to shocks, whether it be technology, like roboticization, and issues with regard to either shocks from trade or technology. So I'm suggesting that the lens that you should be thinking about with regard to policy has a more narrow focus than the national lens, in order to actually get at what is the particular issue that comes with.
Yeah.
I'm fixing the dollar, right?
May I respond to that?
And then you can take me off.
Okay. I'm more looking to agree, actually. But.
On the dollar, the challenge there, of course, and it is absolutely, the dollar is not particularly related to the trade balance, and hasn't been basically since the origin of the floating rate period. Financial flows dominate the dollar. Financial flows drive trade. So your MAC index is kind of like a transactions tax, except for particularly the way, at least I think I understood it, is the tax increases as the dollar appreciates.
Correct.
So that it's not just a flat tax, some per flow, but it actually is as you said, a peak load pricing.
Correct.
Tax. So you would actually find a lot of support for a transactions tax. You would find a lot of support for a transactions tax, even in the financial community, because of the belief that algorithmic trading and like nanosecond by nanosecond trading is damaging to financial markets. You can find, and with a lot of developing countries or emerging markets, with you 100% for transactions tax. Having that transactions tax be modulated by the movement in the exchange value of the dollar gets a little bit dicier, because against which currency? You have a different transactions tax for each bilateral currency as it appreciates vis-a-vis the dollar?
My understanding it's against a
If you do
basket.
that, just think about the arbitrage opportunities that you have opened up for people that work with me. And I bet you wouldn't like the outcome of that. So, interesting potential idea, a lot of support in a lot of ways for flat transactions tax, but this modulated one, I don't think it's operational.
Interesting, and I will take that back to the real economists who've helped me, with my data here, and I would welcome if any of you would like to hear more. I'm sure GIC can get put in touch with some of the people that helped me here, but my understanding is that it works against a basket of currencies. It would be set against a basket, so it wouldn't be against, individual currencies, but I don't understand all of the mechanism of it, so we'd have to think a little bit more about it. I will also take the feedback that it was interesting that you think there would be support for that because we thought that would be exactly the opposite we would find. But anyway, back to the clusters point you made, I certainly agree with that. In fact, that's why my company remains in Chicago and Cook County, despite the ridiculously high taxes here. We're in a cluster that helps make us so successful. Our platers are nearby, our painters are nearby, and back to my telecom industry roots, our big customer used to be nearby. Western Electric was right up the road when, it was the early, 1900s. So I totally believe that. And my pain point in 2000 was when the telecom cluster, so to speak, left this whole country. But what I failed to understand or appreciate, or maybe you can answer, like with Foxconn, right, these states, it sounds like what you would be arguing is that, for more micro incentives and more micro policy, and then we get these where one state's competing against the other, one city's competing against the other, and we've got, I certainly agree with that, and I'm down in Springfield advocating the same thing, and in Cook County as well advocating the same thing, but I'm not necessarily sure it's right, but I appreciate the point and don't really disagree either. I just don't know what is right or what right answer. I think it's a little both, really.
So I think we have Kevin had a couple comments on this topic too.
Yeah, so I just feel like I need to defend the honor of economists.
It was meant to be a friendly joke. I apologize.
By the way, I just want to thank Zach for coming into the Lions Den, the Chicago Fed, home of economists, and so thank you.
So,
All right, no,
just because economists, by and large, are free traders, and I agree, there's no such thing as free trade, but, there still are some things called comparative advantage that still matter. Just a couple comments. To me, as an economist, it's puzzling why steel users would favor policies that raise their input costs. That's puzzling to me.
Let me just offer one reason for that. Also coming off of a lot of our roundtables is when the economy is as hot as it is and one of the strongest economies, they're finding the ability of passing along those costs to the customers. I think we would find a very different attitude, Zach, if the economy was not growing at 3%, but growing much slower, where they were to be struggling trying to pass those along.
Pricing power is back, and that's a wonderful thing after 20 years.
Just a couple other comments. You say your order book is full, yet the dollar is overvalued, so that seems like an inconsistency to me. I think you're right that globalization has had an effect on reducing manufacturing employment, but certainly automation has also had an effect on reducing employment, substitution of capital for labor, and that's been going on for decades. I used to be a farmer in eastern Colorado, and the average size of the farm in Colorado now is several thousand acres, and 100 years ago it was 40 or 50. So that is a factor that you can't ignore. We've heard the same arguments with China today that we heard with Japan in the 1980s, that Japan was going to take over the world, and clearly they didn't. And my last comment, well, next to last comment, is that as a Hamilton file, Alexander Hamilton favored tariffs because that was the primary way that the government raised revenue.
Absolutely.
And his primary concern at that time was to pay off the debt incurred during the Revolutionary War and establish a good credit rating for the U.S. So I want to make that point. And then finally, I think as my results showed and other results have showed, domestic factors dominate. The gains from trade certainly are positive. Economists estimate anywhere from 2 to 8% of GDP. They're not huge, but they're not small either. So I think when you get the domestic economy right, that benefits you at the end of the day.
Any other questions from
One to the right, Steve.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm Syracuse Hale from EconView. My question is for Zach, very specifically. Loved your presentation. It's good to hear firing line. But if the point of pain for most people are finding good workers, why aren't you raising wages?
I am.
Why aren't you investing in more automation to offset what Bill was talking about? What are most people doing? Why don't they react?
I think we are doing all of that. So I can tell you anecdotally, I've been giving raises all summer. The average raise has been 4 to 5%. So it jives with exactly the data you're saying. I'm very concerned about maintaining and keeping my top workforce. I'm very lucky to have such much talent at our place. So want to keep those people and then attracting other ones. Yes. I mean, you can't offer the outside more than you're paying your guy right now doing it or gal. So you have to raise their wages first, and then you can start raising the wages that you're offering on the outside to attract more people in. As far as automation, we are working on that. Some is easier said than done. Our business in particular is a high mix, low volume, high complexity business, and it's not always well suited to automation for all of its processes. But we've invested in technology like these massive multi-axis machines that you move it from one machine to the next for the different operations. Now one machine does it all at once, even though it's relatively low volume. So we've seen some improvements there. I think in general, the automation will help my labor problem more in the service industry, especially the low rung, where you're going to be ordering your food at McDonald's on the screen, and now I can hire the manager of McDonald's who's got some brains in her head and move her up into a manufacturing job. So that's where I see automation really helping manufacturing. Did I miss a piece of your question? Thank you.
Done.
Is there a preferred explanation that the panel has for the decline in capacity utilization peaks? We keep peaking at lower and lower numbers. Is that obsolescence? Is that something else?
That's a great question, and one that I have struggled to come up with an answer myself. And one begins to wonder how much of some of the capacity that's out there is maybe antiquated and is not being reflective of the more high-tech technology that's out there. So you might have a lot of machinery still sitting out there, but maybe isn't the most optimum.
And then 78 could be the old 80, if that's the case. Peak at a lower number, you have to have some sort of trend.
It's been getting older since, that's the version, that's another way of talking about that age profile for not just the U.S. economy, but for all advanced economies, that capital is really old.
Right. So it used to be that, I'll tell a quick story. When I was growing up, my father ran a machine shop building comforter and quilting machines in New York, and I got hired for the summer, which was one of the best jobs I ever had. Convinced me to go get a really good education because I didn't want to do this for the rest of my life. But I was running a Bridgeport milling machine, and it was, turning dials and having that cutting tool come in, and I would come in too fast and break the tool. But that machine was probably twice as old as I was, but still worked. That is not how manufacturers today think about their machines. And that's why the timing of when you buy these high-tech machines, which go down in value because of it being computer-related, becomes critical. And the payback, well, I'll ask Zach, what do you think your typical member, what they want to get paid back on their machine is in today's environment?
Well, I'm sure they'd like to get paid back in 2 to 3 years, but that's not the case.
Right.
It's typically a 5, 10, or longer year payback period. And those machines last 20 years, typically, you expect.
Right. 5 to 7 years is what I've often heard for the payback, and that has been cut down substantially from, typically a 20 to 30-year life cycle, because they understand they either have to rebuild the brains of the machine as technology improves, or just have to replace it altogether.
Yeah, I echo everything that you just said there.
Is there a question on the upper?
I think it's been addressed, but I've been watching the productivity drop discussion for the last year or two, and I can understand why manufacturers themselves are a little cautious. What lessons have we learned in the past? And best, how long's the market? Is there going to be a bust? So what do I do then with those capital investments? But are there other ways? Is it just capital investment in equipment to do productivity? Or is it, what have we learned in the past, I guess?
Well, productivity comes about from a host, and that's why it's very difficult to really put your thumb on the pulse of what's driving it. Productivity comes about by adding machinery to the equation, comes about by adding better machinery to the equation. It comes about by educating your workforce, as Zach was talking about, to make sure that they're capable of running the equipment and knowing how to, I mean, we've actually heard from a manufacturer early this year that sent a piece of equipment back because the piece of equipment was too sophisticated for their available workforce, and they kept smashing the machine. It was a 25 grand cost every time they did it. They did it 3 times, and they went back to the manufacturer and said, give us one of your lower skilled level machines because we just can't run this one. So it is a matter of making sure that your workforce, and not just in manufacturing, but that's kind of my top concern for the U.S. economy as a whole. As you think about some of the technologies coming down the path, whether it's AI, autonomous, can be very, very devastating to the number of jobs that are out there, making sure you have your workforce prepared to move into other areas that have some value.
I would just add that, going back to Joseph Schumpeter, economists have long known that innovation and the development of new ideas is crucial to developing and growing an economy. So, we aren't a monopoly producer on new ideas. New ideas are generated across the world. So if you wall yourself off from the rest of the world, you potentially remove a key source of growth and development for your economy. Not only in terms of that, but also the importing of individuals who may be very smart who want to get an education here.
So,
as a follow-up?
well, let me, yeah, so I agree with what Kevin just said about the innovation, and that's really the game changer, but I would just add that innovation doesn't just hover above the Great Plains, you're right? It typically is tied with where you make the product, especially in manufacturing, at least the type of innovation. I mean, talk about chip innovation and these things. When you stop making the things here, you lose those incremental gains in innovation, and I would also echo what Bill said about these super complex machines. I spent several $1 million on new equipment in 2015, and we still haven't quite figured out exactly how to make it do all the amazing things that it's supposed to do. So I share that sentiment. There's a lot of gains to be made as we continue to train and learn about our workforce, and our equipment.
Summarizing what I heard is, one, to increase our productivity, we need to train our labor force more, and 2, maybe we need to find more ways to innovate in the incubators, the M-hubs, the other places to create that. Is that a correct interpretation, or?
Yeah, but I still, my main point was that we are in the process of seeing an investment cycle which had been lacking for the first, let's call it 7 years of the expansion, that is now coming back and making up for some lost time. And I think just having that capital deepening, as we refer to it in economics, is going to allow productivity to do better, to give the means of making each and every worker who uses those technologies and the machinery more productive.
And even Zach said that, manufacturers, and non-manufacturers as well, bemoan the lack of qualified workers.
Absolutely.
And again, those are a function of domestic factors, not international factors.
So I feel the large and looming hook to my left. But can we just thank the panel?